You are a European physician on a diplomatic mission in Antananarivo. The year is 1861, and before you lies the body of the most feared woman in the Indian Ocean. Ritual cuts mark her skin. Though cold, the air around her still reeks of blood, incense, decay, and something harder to name, fear. This is not a legal autopsy. It's an act cloaked in danger in silence. Armed marina soldiers stand by, unspeaking, watching your every move. The queen is gone, but her shadow looms large. Her name, Ranavalona I, is still spoken in hushed, nervous tones. She wasn't merely a monarch, she was a warning. A wife, a widow, a mother, an executioner. Now that she is dead, one question clings to every corner of the room: was she truly a cannibal queen, or was that label crafted by those who couldn't stomach the sight of a woman wielding unchecked power? As your blade presses into skin hardened by decades of rule, your mind returns to the rumors, the ones traded in the markets, whispered in portside bars, muttered between foreign soldiers. She boiled her enemies alive. She made women eat their dead husbands. She buried bones in heaps beneath her palace floor. Some scoffed. Some swore by it. But everyone agrees on one thing: for 33 years, she ruled Madagascar with a grip sharper than any weapon. To understand how she became the most feared woman in Africa, you must begin here, with her body, and the story it still holds. In the year 1788, deep in the misty highlands of Imarina, a child was born who, by all expectations of her time and station, should have vanished into obscurity. She had no noble blood, no royal lineage, and no claim to greatness. Her name was Ravo, later known as Ramavo, a name not spoken with celebration, but with cautious curiosity. She was the daughter of a minor officer in a rigid society stratified by lineage, tradition, and the lingering specter of slavery. In Madagascar, where blood dictated one's future and power was passed down through sacred lines, a girl like Ramavo was a shadow, someone to cook, clean, marry, and disappear. But history has a way of turning on small hinges, and for Ramavo, that hinge came in the form of her father's courage. He was a man with little authority but sharp instincts. Within the palace, plots brewed like storms, and one of them, an insidious conspiracy to overthrow King Andrian Ampoinamarina, made its way to him. In a court where betrayal was a language fluently spoken, and silence could mean survival, her father chose defiance. He brought the plot to light. This act, both suicidal and noble, altered the trajectory of his daughter's life. The king, stunned by the officer's rare loyalty, did not reward him with gold or land. Instead, he offered something far more dangerous and permanent: a marital bond with the royal family. One of his wives, he declared, would come from the man's household. It was a political maneuver cloaked in royal favor, a calculated way to bind an outsider to the monarchy. And so it was decided. The young girl from a modest background would marry the king's son, Prince Radama. No one sang. No crowds gathered. It was not a love story, nor a triumph. It was an obligation sealed with silence and strategy. Ramavo, barely more than a child, was now property of the crown. To those at court, she was a footnote, a social transaction to reward loyalty. No one imagined that within this quiet girl existed the seeds of something far more formidable. She did not step into the palace halls with grandeur. She entered them as an outsider, ignored, overlooked, and quietly resented. The royal court was a world of whispers, where alliances were fragile and power was earned not just through birthright, but through patience, calculation, and cruelty. Ramavo said little. She asked for nothing. She observed. She remembered. While the others dismissed her as simple, rooted in rural tradition and unworthy of refinement, she watched. Prince Radama, her husband, was everything she was not: educated, enamored with Europe, a student of Christianity and firearms, dazzled by French books and British manners. He saw Madagascar not as a kingdom, but as a flawed canvas awaiting European paint. And in Ramavo, he saw the past, something backward, something primitive. He despised her, not just because she came from lowly origins, but because she reminded him of what he wished to erase. He made no effort to hide his disdain. Yet she did not react. She neither protested nor pleaded for affection. She played her part and waited. Years passed. Radama rose to the throne. Ramavo's position remained unchanged, unloved, unimportant, and unnoticed. But beneath that silence, something was growing: resolve, strategy, and a sense of timing sharp as a knife. Ramavo had been handed a place near the crown, and while others dismissed her presence as decorative, she knew better. She understood that proximity to power is its own kind of weapon. All she had to do was wait for the right moment. When it came, it would arrive not with ceremony, but with death. In 1828, King Radama died, his health ruined by drink, his reign cut short, and, most importantly, without an heir. What followed was a sudden and dangerous vacuum. The nobles braced for chaos. Other royal clans saw opportunity. But Ramavo, the quiet woman in the corner, saw destiny. She was no longer just the daughter of a loyal officer. She was a contender. A threat. A shadow that had outlived kings. And as history would soon witness, that shadow was about to stretch over an entire nation. Ramavo's marriage to Prince Radama was never meant to be a union of hearts. It was not born from affection or desire, but from calculation and political convenience. She was offered to him not as a partner, but as a reward, an unremarkable woman tied to an act of loyalty her father had performed years before. To Radama, young and ambitious, she represented everything he wanted to leave behind. While Ramavo was quiet, grounded in tradition, and steeped in ancestral customs, Radama had his eyes fixed on Europe. He devoured French literature, studied European weaponry, welcomed Christian missionaries, and dreamed of transforming Madagascar into a modern kingdom in the image of the West. In Ramavo, he saw a relic, someone too rooted in the very Malagasy identity he was desperate to shed. He didn't hide his disdain. He belittled her intellect, dismissed her presence, and openly pursued more sophisticated companions. And through it all, Ramavo said nothing. She did not fight for his affection or protest his rejection. She absorbed every insult, every slight, and filed it away like a meticulous scribe. She became a fixture in the palace, always there, always silent, always watching. Others might have mistaken her silence for submission. But it wasn't weakness. It was strategy. She learned to read the room, to track shifting loyalties, to see how power flowed, not just through blood, but through observation, timing, and restraint. When Radama eventually rose to the throne, she remained overlooked, her name barely whispered in court. But she did not waver. She waited. In a palace where every spoken word could be a trap, silence was the safest weapon. And Ramavo wielded it masterfully. She knew that her moment would come, not because it was promised, but because she would be the only one prepared to seize it. And so, behind the quiet gaze and the seemingly docile demeanor, a storm was gathering. The ignored wife, the invisible woman, was not idle. She was sharpening herself, slowly, deliberately, for the day when the crown would fall within reach, and the world would finally see what silence had been hiding. In 1828, the silence shattered. King Radama was dead, struck down by illness and drink, and most crucially, without an heir. The kingdom, built on bloodlines and tradition, fell into chaos. Royal factions stirred. Cousins and generals whispered. The law dictated that in the absence of a direct successor, the crown should pass to another branch of the royal family. But Ramavo had waited too long and watched too carefully to let that happen. This was her moment. With a swiftness that stunned the court, she moved. No appeals. No petitions. No compromise. She aligned herself with the traditionalist nobles, those who resented Radama's embrace of European influence, who feared the erosion of ancestral customs, who longed for a return to a sovereign, self-defined Madagascar. They saw in Ramavo not just a widow, but a shield, unyielding, native, and unafraid. She also secured the loyalty of key factions of the military, commanders who respected discipline, strength, and certainty. With their support, she unleashed a purge that would define the beginning of her reign. In less than a week, over 30 members of the royal family were executed. Half-brothers, rival consorts, distant cousins, any noble who might claim the throne, none were spared. European advisors who had championed Radama's reforms were driven out or killed. The palace ran red. The silence Ramavo had mastered for years was now broken by the sound of screams, and with each death, her authority solidified. She did not inherit power. She seized it, piece by bloody piece. When her coronation came, it was not a celebration. There were no cheers, no parades. It was a declaration, cold, exact, and irreversible. From that moment on, she was no longer Ramavo. She was Ranavalona I, Queen of Madagascar. And the era of mercy was over. Her rule had begun not with blessing, but with warning. She would reign alone, without compromise, and without forgiveness. The world beyond Madagascar did not stay silent for long. News of Ranavalona's bloody rise traveled fast, carried by traders, diplomats, and missionaries who had once seen the island as ripe for influence. In Paris, London, and Lisbon, whispers turned to headlines. They called her barbaric, savage, deranged. But what most of them failed to grasp was that Ranavalona had not simply taken the throne, she had declared war on foreign intrusion. To her, European missionaries were not holy men, they were cultural saboteurs. Their schools did not teach enlightenment, they dismantled identity. Their churches were not sanctuaries, they were outposts of foreign conquest. She had watched Radama open the gates, welcoming Christianity, French books, British firearms, and saw how easily influence turned to control. So she did what almost no monarch in her position had dared to do, she shut the gates. One by one, she dismantled every channel of European encroachment. Christianity was outlawed. Mission schools were closed, their buildings either abandoned or burned. Malagasy children were no longer to be taught foreign creeds. The Bible, once printed and distributed with fanfare under Radama, was declared a threat to the spirit of the people. In public squares, entire piles of holy books were set alight, not out of hatred for the divine, but as a fierce rejection of colonization disguised as salvation. But Ranavalona's measures did not end at paper and policy. The suppression of the new faith grew brutal. Native pastors who refused to recant their beliefs were crucified and left for days as warnings. Others were tortured, exiled, or killed in front of crowds. And foreign missionaries, those who had invested years building communities and translating scriptures, were ordered to leave the island under threat of death. Some fled. Others stayed too long and paid the price. Still, she was far from irrational. To Ranavalona, this was not cruelty for its own sake, it was preservation. She believed, with a clarity that bordered on obsession, that the future of Madagascar depended on protecting it from ideological infection. To allow foreign religions and customs to take root was to surrender from within. And she had not fought for power simply to watch it rot from the inside. European governments were outraged. Their envoys sent letters. Their merchants protested. Their missionaries begged. Ranavalona ignored them all. She replied once, famously and coldly, "Your faith is poison. Your customs are disease. Do not mistake our patience for submission." And with that, Madagascar entered isolation. Trade was restricted to tightly controlled channels. Diplomats were tolerated but watched. European advisors were gradually removed from influence, their presence shrunk to the margins. The queen surrounded herself instead with local nobles, priests of ancestral tradition, and generals loyal only to her. Within a few short years, she transformed a country leaning toward modernity into a kingdom fiercely reconnected to its roots. It was not without consequence. The cost in blood, fear, and stagnation was immense. But in Ranavalona's eyes, it was a necessary purge. Where others saw tyranny, she saw defense. And as foreign ships anchored off her coasts with missionaries, explorers, and economic dreams aboard, she made one thing clear: Madagascar would remain Malagasy, not just in land, but in soul. And she would sacrifice anything to ensure it stayed that way. Of all the weapons Queen Ranavalona wielded during her reign, none was more feared, or more uniquely hers, than the poison trial known as the Tangina ordeal. It was not new. The ritual had existed in Madagascar long before her, a traditional method of divine judgment used to determine guilt or innocence. But under Ranavalona, it became something far more systematic. It became state policy, legal doctrine, and moral terror, rolled into one. The concept was deceptively simple and brutally poetic. The accused would be forced to consume a poison brewed from the bark of the sacred Tangina tree. If the body rejected it, if the person vomited 3 times, they were declared innocent. Their survival, or more accurately, their ability to purge, was taken as a sign from the ancestors, an absolution from the gods. But if they failed to vomit or died from the toxin, their guilt was unquestioned. No trial. No cross-examination. The gods had spoken. For centuries, this ritual had been used sparingly, mostly in cases of witchcraft or spiritual violation. Ranavalona changed that. She resurrected and repurposed the ordeal as a tool of absolute control. Under her decree, the Tangina trial was expanded beyond superstition. It became the answer to political dissent, personal betrayal, religious defiance, and even rumor. If someone whispered criticism, if a noble hesitated in allegiance, if a villager was caught with a foreign Bible, they could be summoned and made to drink. It was indiscriminate and chillingly efficient. People feared accusations more than armies. Because once named, there was no appeal, no mercy, only the cup. The poison trial didn't just kill individuals. It paralyzed society. Families turned on each other. Villages policed themselves with obsessive paranoia. Faith, once held quietly in private, became a dangerous secret. And the numbers were staggering. Contemporary observers, both Malagasy and European, estimate that between 75,000 and 150,000 people perished as a direct result of the Tangina ordeal during Ranavalona's reign. For a kingdom with a modest population, it was nothing short of demographic trauma. And yet, within the court, the ritual was hailed as righteous, as necessary, as divine justice. For Ranavalona, the Tangina was more than tradition, it was proof of sovereignty. It declared that guilt was not defined by foreign laws or European courts but by Madagascar's own gods and, by extension, by her. Each trial reinforced her image as the chosen guardian of ancestral will. Each execution without a sword made her more terrifying than any executioner. What made the ordeal even more horrifying was its randomness. You did not have to be a criminal. You only had to be inconvenient. You could be accused for political purposes, to settle old rivalries, or to fill quotas of obedience. And because the poison was real, deadly, unrefined, unforgiving, there was no theater. People died in agony, often within hours, sometimes within minutes. Vomiting blood, writhing in public, their deaths were both spectacle and warning. It was justice weaponized through fear, divinity manipulated through chemistry. The Tangina ordeal became the soundless scream at the heart of Ranavalona's Madagascar, a ritual that no one questioned because it was backed by gods, endorsed by the queen, and enforced by death. In a world where foreign courts might sentence with robes and gavels, she needed no such pomp. She had a cup, a bark, a command. And in that cruel concoction, she distilled her power, unflinching, sacred, and utterly lethal. While Ranavalona ruled through silence, poison, and ritual, she also understood the raw, visible language of force. Power, she knew, must be seen to be believed, and feared. For that, she built an army, not just to defend borders, but to protect her throne, suppress her enemies, and maintain the illusion of total control. By the middle of her reign, the army of Madagascar had grown to over 30,000 men. These soldiers were not foreign-trained mercenaries or professional warriors steeped in European drill books. They were Malagasy men, recruited from across the island, shaped through relentless discipline and bound by oaths not just of loyalty to the kingdom, but to the queen herself. To serve Ranavalona was not simply military service. It was submission to a living deity. Discipline was strict, and punishment for failure was swift. Training involved both spiritual indoctrination and physical hardship. Soldiers were taught to see her will as law, her word as sacred, and her enemies as threats to the very soul of the nation. Armed with a blend of traditional spears, axes, and outdated muskets, some of them smuggled or locally replicated from European designs, the army was a strange hybrid of ancient and improvised modernity. Yet despite the clumsiness of its weapons, it proved terrifyingly effective. Ranavalona's troops were trained in guerrilla tactics, ambushes, and brutal suppression. They were not designed to fight foreign powers in set-piece battles, but to crush rebellion from within, to extinguish dissent before it grew teeth. And when rebellion came, as it did, inevitably, in whispers and sparks, Ranavalona's response was total. Rebels were not merely executed, they were annihilated. One preferred method was boiling. Prisoners, sometimes entire groups of them, were thrown into great iron cauldrons and slowly cooked alive. It was a punishment not just for the condemned, but for the community that birthed them. Another punishment was impalement, slow, public, and deliberately grotesque. Spikes were raised at crossroads and city entrances. Dissenters were hoisted upon them, their bodies left to rot in the sun, swaying above the people they had once stood beside. But perhaps the most harrowing spectacle of all was reserved for nobles and those in the queen's inner circle who dared to question or resist. These individuals were often dismembered in public squares. Limbs severed, torsos quartered, their deaths became theater, part warning, part ritual, and fully intentional. The message was clear: treason did not die quietly. These horrors were not random acts of cruelty. They were policy. They were strategy. Ranavalona understood the psychological architecture of power. Where foreign rulers used parchment and treaties, she used terror. Where others relied on laws, she relied on memory, the memory of what happened to those who challenged her. Madagascar, under her rule, became a fortress not just of stone and earth, but of fear. Foreigners called it isolationism. But it was more than that. It was self-containment by design. Trade with Europe slowed to a trickle, limited to carefully chosen intermediaries who were watched as closely as enemies. Embassies remained, but their power was neutered. Diplomats walked gingerly, knowing that a wrong word could lead to expulsion, or worse. The queen's distrust of the outside world became law. Internally, the island transformed into a closed circuit. Cultural preservation became sacred duty. Traditional beliefs were elevated to state dogma. Political loyalty and spiritual obedience fused into one path: devotion to Ranavalona, mother of the land, guardian of the ancestors. To many on the outside, this looked like madness. To many on the inside, it felt like suffocation. But to her most faithful, soldiers, elders, priestesses, it was protection. They called her the mother who punishes to protect, a phrase whispered with equal parts fear and reverence. She was no longer just a queen. She was the embodiment of national will, an icon both sacred and terrifying. In every spear held high, in every musket loaded, in every boiling cauldron and sun-bleached corpse, her rule declared itself again and again: you may hate me, but you will not unseat me. Because power, once soaked in blood, does not bleed easily. As the years of Ranavalona's rule stretched on, her image abroad became increasingly mythologized and monstrous. In the colonial ports of Europe, her name was passed from sailor to trader, whispered in taverns, recorded in diplomatic letters, and gradually transformed into legend. She was no longer simply a queen. She became a specter, a cautionary tale, a symbol of exotic savagery for a continent that feared what it could not control. And at the dark heart of this legend was one persistent question: was Ranavalona a cannibal? The stories were grotesque, specific, and deeply disturbing. French merchants who barely escaped Madagascar alive claimed they had seen bodies hanging in trees, skinned and half-eaten. Some swore that children were cooked alive to punish rebellious mothers. Others spoke of banquet halls where traitors' flesh was served to their own families. The most chilling tale was of wives being forced to consume the flesh of their executed husbands, an act of psychological obliteration, a ritualized humiliation designed to break both body and soul. These accounts, though never officially verified, spread with extraordinary speed. Colonial newspapers published them with gory detail. Missionaries returning from the island added their own fearful testimonies, often mixing truth with trauma. The idea of a cannibal queen reigning over a sealed island of poison and fire was too potent a symbol for Europe to resist. It fed neatly into the narrative of African barbarism, a justification for future intervention, a moral excuse for imperial expansion. And yet, even now, the question lingers, were the stories true? Some modern historians argue that they were fabrications, crafted by frightened men who barely understood the culture they encountered. They point out that cannibalism had no deep-rooted tradition in Malagasy society, and that such claims mirror the standard tropes used to demonize indigenous rulers around the world. Ranavalona, in this view, was not a cannibal, but a target of colonial propaganda. Others, however, are less quick to dismiss the possibility. They argue that power, when wielded without limits, can give rise to practices that defy logic and morality. In a court ruled by fear, surrounded by sycophants and soldiers, it is not unthinkable that rituals were invented or revived to reinforce the queen's divine image and her absolute dominance. And if these stories weren't literally true, they were metaphorically accurate to many who lived under her rule. Ranavalona consumed everything that opposed her, whether by poison, spear, or decree. She devoured dissent. She swallowed rebellion. Her policies left behind mass graves, broken families, and a society kept in check by ritual, fear, and spectacle. For the common Malagasy citizen, there may have been no need to see her eat human flesh. The destruction she enacted on lives and futures was more than enough to give the rumors breath. Regardless of the truth, the legend endured. In the minds of Europeans, she became a monstrous queen ruling over a twilight island, unreachable and unforgivable. In Madagascar, the whispers were different, more cautious, more nuanced. Some believed the worst. Others refused to speak at all. But everyone agreed on one thing: whether flesh was eaten or not, Ranavalona ruled with a hunger that no court, no god, and no empire could satisfy. By the final decade of her reign, Ranavalona no longer ruled only her people, she ruled her fears. What had begun as strategic caution hardened into paranoia, and the queen who once wielded silence and terror with precise control became consumed by suspicion. She had outlived rivals, silenced enemies, and buried threats in mass graves, but with every year of survival came a new enemy in the shadows. She believed her food was poisoned. She refused to eat from the same dish twice. Her servants were replaced constantly, often without warning, sometimes without reason. Whispers in the palace corridors spoke of taste testers dropping dead or vanishing after a single wrong glance. Her chambers, once designed for ceremony and elegance, became traps. Quite literally. She ordered hidden snares installed in the corridors of her palace, spring-loaded spikes beneath floorboards, blades tucked into decorative walls, trapdoors designed to capture or impale. Guards were rotated frequently, but none were ever trusted. Even her most loyal advisors were not safe. One of her highest-ranking ministers, a man who had stood beside her for decades, was executed not for betrayal or treason, but for admitting he had dreamt of the queen's death. That was all it took. In Ranavalona's world, even dreams were a form of conspiracy. She stopped sleeping in the same room 2 nights in a row. No one, not guards, not attendants, ever knew exactly where she would lie down. Her bedroom became a secret reshuffled each dusk, like a game played against invisible assassins. This constant vigilance didn't bring her peace. It isolated her. the palace became less a seat of power and more a labyrinth designed to keep her alive. But it also kept her alone. Few dared speak plainly. Fewer still dared offer counsel. She ruled through memory, of bloodshed past, of betrayals avoided, but that memory slowly devoured her sense of reality. She saw ghosts where there were none. She heard plots in casual conversation. To some, she was a woman possessed by spirits. To others, she was a monarch driven mad by too many years of unchecked power. But none dared say it aloud. Not while she still breathed. Not while the poison cup, the boiling pot, and the impalement pike still stood ready. Ranavalona, once a master of controlled terror, had become a prisoner of it. And yet she clung to the throne with the same resolve she had shown from the beginning, determined that no foreigner, no traitor, no unseen force would ever take it from her. In the end, nothing could, except time itself. In 1861, after more than 3 decades of blood, isolation, and fear, Queen Ranavalona I died. Not from poison, nor by assassin's blade, nor at the hands of a usurper, but quietly, in her bed, at the age of 73, an astonishing lifespan for the time, especially for a woman who had ruled surrounded by enemies. Her death came not with fanfare or national mourning, but with an uneasy silence, as if even in dying, she held the breath of an entire kingdom in her clenched fist. Those closest to her treated her body with religious reverence. Soldiers stood guard beside her corpse. Servants bathed her in sacred oils. She was interred in a grand mausoleum she had commissioned herself, stone, towering, and solemn, a monument to her vision of sovereign, unyielding Madagascar. But though her body lay still, her legacy did not. Many believed her spirit would never rest, that she had ruled too harshly, lived too fiercely, to simply vanish. Her name continued to echo through the highlands, in fear and reverence, as though the land itself still remembered the weight of her footsteps. With her death, the doors she had sealed began to creak open. Her son and successor, Ranavalona II, was everything she had rejected, a reformer, a man with European tutors and European dreams. Almost immediately, he repealed many of her harshest decrees. The Tangina poison ordeal was abolished. Christian missionaries were welcomed back. Foreign trade resumed. Diplomats returned with cautious optimism. For some, it felt like liberation. For others, it felt like betrayal. But one thing was undeniable: the reign of terror had ended. Yet so had a certain defiant independence. Without Ranavalona's brutal walls, Madagascar would soon face something she had always feared: colonial encroachment. And in time, that fear would become reality. Ranavalona I did not leave behind a simple legacy. She left behind a fracture, a wound in memory that refuses to heal cleanly. To some, especially foreign historians and missionaries of her era, she was a monster cloaked in royal robes, a tyrant who ruled not by law but by fear, who rejected reason and embraced cruelty, who crucified the faithful, silenced the learned, and boiled the disobedient alive. Her actions, by any modern measure, were extreme, often barbaric. The poison trials, the executions, the forced isolation of an entire island, these are not easily defended. And yet, for many in Madagascar, the story is more complicated. Ranavalona is not remembered only as a butcher. She is remembered as a shield. At a time when European powers were carving up the African continent with impunity, she stood alone, defiant. Where other monarchs capitulated to missionaries, treaties, and guns, she said no. She preserved the religious, cultural, and political independence of Madagascar for over 30 years. She was the last great wall between her people and the colonial tide. That wall, built of blood and dread, was brutal, but it held. Without her, the gates might have opened far sooner. Some argue that her reign delayed colonization by decades, buying time that others never had. Was she a tyrant? Absolutely. But was she also a patriot? To many, yes. She ruled as though the survival of her culture depended on fear, and perhaps in her time, it did. Her enemies were not just internal rebels or stubborn missionaries, they were empires with maps already drawn, waiting to replace her world with their own. To stand against that required not just stubbornness, but cruelty. And Ranavalona wielded both with terrifying precision. Her legacy, then, is a paradox. She is both destroyer and protector, villain and matriarch. For some, her memory is a scar. For others, a banner. But no one forgets her. And in that, she achieved what few rulers ever do, immortality not in myth, but in contradiction. A woman feared by the world who refused to be shaped by it. What would you sacrifice to protect what you believe in? How far would you go, not just to defend land or borders, but a way of life, a language, a spirit? Ranavalona I asked herself those questions every day of her reign, and whether we agree with her answers or not, she answered them with fire. She ruled not to be loved but to be remembered. And in that, she succeeded beyond measure. Hers was a reign not built on diplomacy, charm, or compromise, but on conviction, unyielding, brutal, and absolute. She did not bend, not to missionaries, not to generals, not to kings across the sea. While other leaders signed treaties and smiled for European painters, she sharpened spears and burned Bibles. To the outside world, that made her savage. To her people, it made her a wall, terrifying, yes, but immovable. Her story is a warning that fear and power, once fused, create a force that shapes not only history but how we remember it. For every tyrant history reviles, there is often a context we're taught to overlook, a desperation, a threat, a reason. That doesn't excuse the horror, but it does demand reflection. Ranavalona was not just a queen. She was a mirror held up to empire, to colonizers, to history itself. And if her legacy disturbs us, perhaps it should. Because history isn't always written by heroes. Sometimes, it's written by survivors, those willing to do what others won't, to say what others fear, and to rule not for glory, but for resistance. If her story made you uncomfortable, good. If it made you question what you thought you knew, better. Share it. Remember it. Because legends like hers don't disappear, they wait, silent, until someone dares to tell them whole.